Italian column is lost. It is 5:30 a.m. on March 1st, 1896, and in the pre-dawn darkness of the Ethiopian highlands near the town of Adwa, 3 Italian brigades, nearly 18,000 men, are stumbling through rocky terrain, exhausted, thirsty, completely disoriented. Their maps are wrong, their guides have fled, and they have just marched directly into the largest African army assembled in the 19th century. On the ridges above, 100,000 Ethiopian warriors wait in silence. Emperor Menelik II, King of Kings, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God, sits on his war throne on a hill overlooking the battlefield. He is 52 years old, wearing the traditional white shama robe and a crown that glints in the first rays of dawn. Beside him stands Empress Taitu Betul, his wife and strategist, who has spent months organizing supplies, rallying troops, and preparing for this moment. Behind them, stretching for miles across the highlands, is an army that represents every corner of Ethiopia. Warriors from Tigray in the north, cavalry from Shewa in the center, riflemen from Harar in the east, spearmen from the southern kingdoms, Christians and Muslims fighting side by side, nobles and peasants, men and women, all united by a single purpose, to stop the European invasion of their homeland. The Italians cannot see them yet. The sun has not risen. The Ethiopian forces are positioned on high ground, concealed by the terrain and the darkness. But they are there, waiting. 100,000 warriors, armed with modern rifles purchased from European arms dealers, traditional swords and spears passed down through generations, and an unshakable determination that this day, on this field, Ethiopia will remain free. An Italian lieutenant named Giuseppe Galliano, 28 years old from Genoa, leads his column through a narrow valley. He is bone-tired, having marched through the night on 4 hours of sleep in 3 days. His men are in worse shape. Some are literally sleepwalking in formation, held upright by the soldiers beside them. "Sir," his sergeant whispers, "I don't like this terrain. We're exposed. The ridges." Galliano is about to respond when the sun crests the eastern mountains and the light reveals what the darkness had hidden. The ridges are covered with warriors, thousands, tens of thousands. A sea of white shamas and glinting spear points stretching as far as the eye can see. For one frozen moment, Giuseppe stares in horror at the magnitude of what his generals have marched them into. Then the Ethiopian war drums begin to thunder. The sound is primal, overwhelming, a rhythm that seems to shake the earth itself. 100,000 voices rise in a war cry that echoes off the mountains. And the Ethiopian army charges. This is the Battle of Adwa. This is the day a European colonial power learned that Africa would not be conquered without cost. This is the day Ethiopia proved that an African nation, unified and determined, could defeat the armies of Europe on the battlefield. This is the day that rewrote the narrative of colonialism and gave hope to oppressed peoples around the world. 17,000 Italians, 100,000 Ethiopians, one battle, one outcome that will echo through history for generations. To understand how Italy came to invade Ethiopia and how Ethiopia came to destroy an Italian army, we must first understand the world of the 1890s, an era when European powers were carving up an entire continent with ruthless efficiency. In 1884 to 1885, European powers meet in Berlin to formalize the Scramble for Africa, the division of the African continent among European colonial empires. At the conference table, men who have never set foot in Africa draw lines on maps, deciding the fate of millions. By 1896, virtually the entire continent is under European control. Britain holds Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria. France controls West and North Africa from Senegal to Algeria. Germany has East Africa, Cameroon, Namibia. Belgium's King Leopold personally owns. The Congo, Portugal holds Angola and Mozambique. Spain has small territories in North and West Africa, One nation stands apart, one ancient kingdom remains defiantly independent: Ethiopia. Ethiopia in the 1890s was the last major independent African state, explains Professor Harold Marcus, historian of Ethiopia at Michigan State University. Every other African kingdom had fallen to European colonization. Ethiopia was the exception, and that exception infuriated European colonial powers who believed Africa was theirs by right of racial superiority. Ethiopia is not just any African nation, it is one of the world's oldest Christian kingdoms, with a continuous history stretching back thousands of years. It has its own alphabet, its own church, its own sophisticated political system. It has never been colonized, and it does not intend to start now. But Italy has other plans. Italy, unified only in 1861, is the newest European power and desperate to prove itself worthy of the title Great Power. Britain has a global empire. France controls vast territories. Even tiny Belgium has colonies. Italy, by comparison, has almost nothing. Italian nationalists are humiliated by this perceived weakness. They believe Italy deserves an empire commensurate with its Roman legacy. Africa seems the logical place to acquire one. Italian colonialism was driven by a toxic combination of nationalism, insecurity, and racism, notes Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, historian of modern Italy at NYU. Italy wanted respect from other European powers, wanted to prove it belonged at the table of empires. And like all colonial powers, Italy justified its aggression with racist ideology, claiming Europeans had a civilizing mission in Africa. Italy already has a toehold in the region. Eritrea, established as an Italian colony in 1890 on the Red Sea coast. From there, Italian eyes turn south to Ethiopia, wealthy, strategically located, and, Italian planners assume, militarily weak. They are catastrophically wrong on that last point. Menelik II ascends to the Ethiopian throne in 1889 after the death of Emperor Johannes IV. He is not a young idealist, but a seasoned politician and military commander, 50 years old, who has spent decades navigating the complex politics of Ethiopian nobility and foreign powers. Menelik understands the European threat better than any African leader of his era. He has watched European powers swallow kingdoms across Africa. He knows Ethiopia's independence depends on two things: military strength and diplomatic cunning. He pursues both with ruthless efficiency. Menelik was a strategic genius, argues Professor Baru Zoud, Ethiopian historian at Addis Ababa University. He played European powers against each other, buying weapons from France and Russia to counter Italian influence, negotiating with Britain to limit Italian expansion. And crucially, he modernized Ethiopia's military, purchasing modern rifles and artillery, and training his forces in their use. Between 1889 and 1896, Menelik imports approximately 100,000 modern rifles, French Lebels, Russian Berdans, British Martini Henrys, plus machine guns and artillery. He establishes armories and trains gunsmiths. He studies European military tactics and adapts them to Ethiopian conditions. He is preparing for the war he knows is coming. Beside him is Empress Taitu Betul, a political force in her own right. Taitu is from the northern nobility, brilliant, fiercely patriotic, and deeply distrustful of European intentions. While Menelik handles diplomacy and military planning, Taitu organizes logistics, rallies support among the nobility, and ensures the army is supplied for a long campaign. Taitu was not just the emperor's wife, she was his partner in governance and war, explains Dr. Tsehai Berhan Selassie, gender historian at UCLA. She commanded troops, made strategic decisions, and her intelligence network provided crucial information about Italian movements. Without Taitu, the victory at Adwa might not have been possible. Together, Menelik and Taitu build an army and a nation prepared to fight for survival. In May 1889, Menelik signs the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy. On the surface, it's a friendship treaty. mutual recognition, trade agreements, Italian support for Menelik's claim to the throne. But there's a problem. Article 17. The Amharic version, Ethiopia's language, states that Menelik may use Italian diplomatic services in dealing with other European powers. The Italian version states that Menelik must use Italian services, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. It is deliberate mistranslation, an act of diplomatic fraud designed to give Italy legal justification for claiming Ethiopia as a colony. When Menelik discovers the deception in 1890, he is furious. He protests to European capitals, insisting Ethiopia is independent and not an Italian protectorate. Italy refuses to acknowledge the error and begins treating Ethiopia as a colonial possession. In February 1893, Menelik formally repudiates the Treaty of Wuchale. He declares that Ethiopia will never be anyone's protectorate. Italy responds with military pressure, occupying border territories, demanding submission. Menelik begins mobilizing for war. Italy's man in Africa is General Oreste Baratieri, 53 years old in 1896, governor of Eritrea and commander of Italian forces in East Africa. Baratieri is a complicated figure, a Garibaldi veteran, politically liberal by Italian standards, but utterly convinced of European racial superiority. He believes Ethiopians are savages who will flee at the first sight of disciplined European troops. Baratieri represented the worst of 19th-century European racism, notes Professor Angelo Del Boca, historian of Italian colonialism. He was not particularly cruel by colonial standards. He didn't commit the atrocities that characterized Belgian or German colonialism, but he held absolute contempt for African military capability. That contempt would destroy his army. By early 1896, Baratieri has approximately 17,700 men under his command, 10,600 Italian soldiers, 4 brigades of infantry, some artillery, minimal cavalry, 7,100 Eritrean askaris, local troops commanded by Italian officers. It is a respectable force by colonial standards. In past African campaigns, similar-sized European armies have defeated African forces 10 times their size. Baratieri assumes Adwa will be no different. Among his officers is Lieutenant Giuseppe Galliano, our young officer from the opening. Giuseppe is a patriot, a believer in Italy's imperial destiny, confident that European discipline and firepower will overcome any African numerical advantage. He has never fought an enemy armed with modern weapons, led by competent commanders and fighting for their homeland's survival. He is about to learn what that combination can do. Adwa was not just a military battle. It was a collision of worldviews. Italy believed European racial superiority guaranteed victory, regardless of circumstances. Ethiopia believed its independence was worth any sacrifice. When those beliefs met on the battlefield, only one would survive. Professor Raymond Jonas, The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire. As 1895 turns to 1896, both sides prepare for the confrontation that will decide Ethiopia's fate. In September 1895, Menelik issues a proclamation that echoes across Ethiopia, calling all able-bodied men to join the army. The response is overwhelming. Warriors gather from every corner of the empire. Ras Alula Ngida brings hardened veterans from Tigray, men who have fought Italians before and know their tactics. Ras Makonnen, father of the future Emperor Haile Selassie, leads forces from Harar, including cavalry and riflemen. Ras Mikhail brings Muslim warriors from Wollo, proving this is a national struggle, transcending religious divisions. Fitawarari. Gebeyehu commands the Imperial Guard, elite troops, personally loyal to Menelik. Empress Taitu personally leads her own force of warriors, including women fighters. By February 1896, approximately 100,000 warriors have assembled, the largest African army of the 19th century. They bring 100,000 modern rifles, dozens of artillery pieces, and hundreds of thousands of traditional spears and swords. Logistics are staggering. Feeding and supplying 100,000 soldiers requires a supply train of hundreds of thousands of porters, pack animals, and camp followers. Te2 personally oversees the supply organization, ensuring ammunition, food, and water reach the troops. The Ethiopian mobilization was a marvel of organization, notes Professor Marcus. This wasn't a disorganized mob. It was a coordinated national effort. Different regional armies maintained their own structures but operated under unified command. The logistics alone were more sophisticated than anything Europeans expected from an African state. Among the warriors is a young Ethiopian named Balcha Safo, 17 years old, from a peasant family in Shewa. Balcha has never been in battle, has received minimal firearms training, but carries a rifle and an unshakable conviction that he is fighting for his country's survival. He will survive Adwa and live to become one of Ethiopia's greatest generals, fighting again 40 years later when Italy returns for a second invasion. While Ethiopia mobilizes, Italy faces a crisis of confidence. Baratieri's aggressive border incursions in late 1895 have met fierce resistance. At Amba Alagi in December 1895, Ethiopian forces destroy an Italian fort, killing or capturing the entire garrison. At Mekelle in January 1896, Ethiopians besiege an Italian fort for 45 days until it surrenders. These are not the easy victories Italy expected. Back in Rome, Prime Minister Francesco Crispi is under immense political pressure. His colonial policy is failing, draining the treasury, producing embarrassing defeats. The Italian public is turning against the war. Crispi sends increasingly desperate telegrams to Baratieri. Win a decisive victory, restore Italian prestige, prove that European arms can defeat African savages. Baratieri knows his position is untenable. He is outnumbered at least 5-1, possibly more. His supply lines are stretched. His troops are exhausted from months of mountain campaigning. His Eritrean askaris are demoralized by recent defeats, and some are deserting. The rational decision is to withdraw to Eritrea, consolidate, wait for reinforcements. But withdrawal would be political suicide. Crispi has made clear that defeat is unacceptable. Baratieri's career, his reputation, his honor, all depend on victory, so he chooses to attack. On February 29, 1896, Baratieri orders his army to advance from their positions and attack the Ethiopian army near Adwa. The plan is complex, perhaps too complex. 4 brigades will advance in separate columns through mountainous terrain at night, then converge at dawn to attack the Ethiopian positions simultaneously. It requires perfect timing, accurate maps, reliable guides, and good luck. They have none of these things. The Italian army begins its night march at 9 o'clock p.m. on February the 29th. 4 brigades, Albertona, Arimondi, Dabormida, and Elena, advance along separate routes through the darkness, each column spread out over miles of rocky mountain trails. Almost immediately, things go wrong. The maps are inaccurate, based on incomplete surveys. The guides have fled or are deliberately misleading the Italians. The terrain is more difficult than expected. Steep ravines, loose rocks, no clear trails. General Albertoni's brigade, supposed to take the rightmost position, drifts too far east in the darkness. By dawn, he is miles from where he should be, separated from the other brigades, completely exposed. General Dabormida's brigade, on the left flank, gets lost in the mountains. His officers argue about directions. They waste hours backtracking and trying different routes. Lieutenant Galliano, marching with Arimondi's brigade in the center, watches the sky lighten and realizes they are nowhere near their intended position. The brigade is strung out in a long column, not deployed for battle. The men are exhausted, having climbed steep terrain in full equipment all night. "Where are we?" a young private asks. Galliano looks at the unfamiliar landscape and realizes with growing horror that he has no idea. At 5:30 a.m., the sun rises, and 100,000 Ethiopian warriors, perfectly positioned on the high ground, look down at the scattered, disorganized Italian columns stumbling through the valleys below. Emperor Menelik II watches the Italian army from his command post on Mount Soloda. His scouts have been tracking the Italian movements all night, reporting every column, every position. The Italians are exactly where he wants them, separated, exhausted, in terrain that favors Ethiopian forces. He gives the order, attack. The Ethiopian war drums begin their thunderous rhythm. 100,000 voices rise in the war cry, and the Ethiopian army surges forward. General Albertone's brigade, approximately 4,000 men, including 2,500 Eritrean askaris, is the first to be hit. His position on the far right is isolated, beyond support from the other Italian brigades. At 6 o'clock a.m., approximately 30,000 Ethiopian warriors, led by Ras Alula, Ras Makonnen, and other commanders, crash into Albertone's position from three sides. The fighting is immediate, brutal, overwhelming. Ethiopian riflemen positioned on high ground pour fire into the Italian ranks. Thousands of rounds crack through the morning air. Italian soldiers fall in clusters, cut down before they can form defensive lines. Albertone tries to organize a fighting retreat, but it's hopeless. His brigade is surrounded, outnumbered, 10-1, and disintegrating under the onslaught. The Eritrean askaris, fighting for an Italian colonial power against fellow Africans defending their independence, begin to waver. Some throw down their weapons and flee. Others switch sides, turning their rifles on their Italian officers. By 7 o'clock a.m., Albertone's brigade has ceased to exist as a fighting force. 2,000 men are dead or captured. The survivors scatter into the mountains. Albertone himself is captured, wounded, humiliated. He will be held prisoner for months before being released in a prisoner exchange. In the center, Generals Arimondi and Elena managed to get their brigades into defensive positions on high ground, the only Italian success of the day. Approximately 6,000 Italian soldiers and 3,000 askaris form a defensive perimeter and dig in. They have artillery, mountain guns that can fire explosive shells, and this gives them brief advantage. Ethiopian forces, perhaps 40,000 warriors, assault the position repeatedly. Waves of warriors charge up the rocky slopes, rifles firing, traditional warriors with spears and swords following close behind. Lieutenant Galliano finds himself in a nightmare. Ethiopian bullets whine past his head, striking the rocks, ricocheting with deadly unpredictability. Men fall around him. The artillery is firing constantly, shells exploding among the attacking Ethiopians, but there are so many, always more, an endless tide. "Hold the line!" his captain screams. "Fire at will!" Galliano fires his revolver at a charging Ethiopian warrior. The man falls. Another takes his place, and another. The fighting at the center will last for hours, a grinding, desperate struggle where the Italians' superior firepower barely compensates for being outnumbered 6-1. On the left flank, General Dabormida's brigade, approximately 3,000 men, is still wandering lost when the battle begins. They hear the gunfire from Albertone's position but cannot locate it. They march toward the sound, trying to link up with friendly forces, and march directly into an Ethiopian army. Ras Mikael's forces, approximately 25,000 warriors from Wollo, have been waiting for them. The Ethiopians attack from all sides simultaneously. Dabormida's column, strung out on a mountain trail, is cut into segments, each segment surrounded and destroyed individually. Dabormida tries to rally his men, tries to form a defensive square, but it's chaos. Units are mixed together. Officers don't know where their soldiers are. The Eritrean askaris are deserting en masse. By 9 o'clock a.m., Dabormida's brigade is dying. Thousands of Ethiopian warriors swarm over the Italian positions. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand. Ethiopian swords against Italian bayonets, a desperate melee where training and discipline mean nothing. Dabor himself is killed, sword in hand, trying to rally one final stand. Of his 3,000 men, fewer than 200 will escape. If you appreciate stories like this, the forgotten victories that challenged colonial empires, the battles where courage and determination defeated technological superiority, the moments when the oppressed stood up and won, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you history not as European conquest narratives, but as the complex, human, global story it actually was. Every week, we explore the battles, the resistance movements, the revolutionary moments that shaped our world. These stories matter because they remind us that empires are not invincible, that resistance is possible, that determined people fighting for their freedom can achieve the impossible. Join us as we uncover these forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe now, because these stories deserve to be told. On the Ethiopian side, Empress Taitu personally commands forces attacking the Italian center. She rides among her warriors, urging them forward, directing fire, her presence inspiring fierce devotion. When Ethiopian casualties mount, and some warriors begin to falter, Taitu rides to the front lines. According to witnesses, she dismounts, picks up a rifle, and fires at the Italian positions. "Are we women or warriors?" she shouts. "Will we let these invaders take our land? Forward for Ethiopia!" The warriors surge forward with renewed fury. Taitu's personal courage at Adwa became legendary, notes Dr. Berhan Selassie. In a deeply patriarchal society, her willingness to fight alongside men, to risk her life, shattered assumptions about women's roles. She became a symbol of Ethiopian resistance, proof that defending the nation was everyone's duty. Young Balcha Safo, fighting in his first battle, sees the Empress leading and feels his fear transform into determination. If the Empress herself fights, how can he do less? He fires his rifle until it's too hot to hold, then picks up a spear from a fallen warrior and charges with the next wave. By noon, the battle is decided. Albertone's brigade is destroyed. Dabor's brigade is annihilated. The center, Arimondi and Elena, is still holding but is being slowly ground down, taking casualties they cannot replace, running low on ammunition. Baratieri, watching from a distance, realizes the battle is lost. He orders a general retreat. The retreat becomes a rout. The disciplined withdrawal that might have saved lives never happens. Units break and run individually. Officers lose control. Men throw away their weapons and equipment to run faster. The Ethiopian cavalry, thousands of horsemen who have been waiting for exactly this moment, pursue relentlessly. Italian soldiers are run down, surrounded, killed, or captured. Lieutenant Galliano runs with his surviving men through ravines and over rocky hills, Ethiopian cavalry always just behind them. He sees men shot in the back as they flee, sees men stumble from exhaustion and be overtaken, sees the last remnants of discipline evaporate into pure animal panic. He will escape, one of the lucky ones, and live to testify about the disaster, though he will never fully recover from the psychological trauma. By sunset on March 1st, 1896, the Battle of Adwa is over. Italian casualties are catastrophic, approximately 7,000 killed, including 4,000 Italian soldiers and 3,000 askaris, 1,500 wounded who reached Italian lines, 3,000 captured, including 2 Italian generals. Of the original 17,700 men, fewer than 7,000 escape in organized units. It is the worst Italian military disaster until the 20th century. Ethiopian casualties are also heavy, 4,000, 5,000 killed, 8,000 to 10,000 wounded. But Ethiopia can absorb these losses. Italy cannot. More significant than the casualties is the symbolic defeat. An African nation has destroyed a European army in open battle. The myth of European invincibility in Africa is shattered. Word of the victory spreads across Africa like wildfire. In colonies from Senegal to South Africa, Oppressed peoples hear that an African army defeated European colonizers and take hope. The reverberations will echo for generations. News of the disaster reaches Rome on March 2nd, transmitted by telegraph from Eritrea. The Italian government and public are stunned. 7,000 dead, 2 generals captured, an army destroyed. Prime Minister Crispi, whose aggressive colonial policy led to Adwa, resigns in disgrace within days. His political career is over. Italy immediately sues for peace. On October the 26th, 1896, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. The terms are unambiguous. Italy recognizes Ethiopian independence unconditionally. The Treaty of Wuchal is annulled. The fraudulent treaty that started the conflict, Italy pays reparations to Ethiopia. Italy retains only Eritrea as a colony, with strictly defined borders. It is a complete Ethiopian victory, total Italian capitulation. Adwa forced Italy to do what no European power had done in the scramble for Africa, recognize an African nation as a sovereign equal, explains Professor Jonas. The treaty didn't just end the war, it established Ethiopia as the one African state that could negotiate with European powers as a peer. The captured Italian prisoners, approximately 3,000 men, are treated well by Ethiopian standards and released in prisoner exchanges over the following months. This humane treatment surprises Europeans, who expected savages to massacre prisoners. Ethiopia's treatment of prisoners becomes part of the Adwa legend, proof that Ethiopian civilization matched or exceeded European claims of superiority. Menelik's triumph. Emperor Menelik II emerges from Adwa as one of Africa's greatest leaders. He uses his victory wisely. Instead of trying to conquer Eritrea or push into Italian territory, he consolidates Ethiopia's borders, modernizes infrastructure, and continues importing weapons and technology. He reigns until 1913, transforming Ethiopia into a modern state while maintaining its independence and traditions. Menelik understood that Adwa was not an endpoint but a beginning, argues Professor Zood. He knew European colonialism wasn't finished, that Ethiopia would face threats again. So he used the breathing room Adwa provided to strengthen Ethiopia's military, economy, and international position. Empress Taitu continues to play a crucial political role, though her relationship with Menelik becomes strained in later years due to succession disputes. She lives until 1918, remembered as one of Ethiopia's greatest heroines. Young Balcha Safo, a peasant soldier, becomes a career military officer. He rises to command his own army and becomes Dejasmak, roughly equivalent to general. When Italy invades Ethiopia again in 1935, 75-year-old Balcha leads resistance fighters, refusing to surrender even when the Ethiopian government accepts Italian occupation. He dies fighting the Italians, full circle from the boy who fought at Adwa nearly 40 years earlier. For Italy, Adwa is a national trauma that festers for 40 years. Italian nationalists, unable to accept that an African nation defeated them in fair battle, create elaborate myths that Ethiopia had European advisors, that Ethiopian weapons were superior, that the battle was lost through betrayal rather than African military competence. These myths prevent Italy from learning Adwa's real lessons about respecting African capabilities. In 1935, fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, obsessed with avenging Adwa and building a new Roman Empire, invades Ethiopia again. This time, Italy uses overwhelming force: aircraft, poison gas, and 500,000 troops. Ethiopia fights heroically, but is overwhelmed. Emperor Haile Selassie, grandson of Ras Makonnen, who fought at Adwa, goes into exile, delivering a famous speech to the League of Nations warning that Ethiopia's fate could be Europe's if fascism is not stopped. His warning is ignored. 3 years later, Europe plunges into World War II. Ethiopia is liberated in 1941 by British and Ethiopian forces. Haile Selassie returns in triumph, and Ethiopia's independence is restored. But the memory of Adwa remains central to Ethiopian identity. The day Ethiopia proved it could defend itself, the day Africa showed it could stand against European imperialism. Adwa's influence extends far beyond Ethiopia. Across Africa, colonized peoples hear about the victory and take inspiration. In the early 20th century, anti-colonial movements from Kenya to South Africa invoke Adwa as proof that European domination is not inevitable. In the African diaspora, Adwa becomes a symbol of black resistance and capability. African Americans, facing Jim Crow segregation and racial violence, celebrate Ethiopia as proof that the racist theories of African inferiority are lies. Marcus Garvey, the Pan-African leader, makes Ethiopia central to his vision of black pride and self-determination. The Rastafarian movement, emerging in Jamaica in the 1930s, venerates Ethiopia and Emperor Haile Selassie as symbols of black sovereignty. Adwa's symbolic power far exceeded its immediate military impact, notes Professor Tony Martin, historian of the African diaspora. It became proof that black people could govern themselves, could build sophisticated civilizations, could defeat white supremacy. In an era when scientific racism claimed black inferiority was biological fact, Ethiopia stood as living refutation. Adwa also demonstrates the limits of European military technology. European powers in the 1890s believed modern weapons guaranteed victory over any non-European enemy. Adwa proved this was a dangerous illusion. Yes, technology matters, but so do leadership, logistics, morale, terrain, and strategic planning. Ethiopia had modern weapons, purchased from Europeans themselves, competent commanders, excellent logistics, and warriors fighting for their homeland. Italy had technological parity but inferior numbers, poor leadership, terrible logistics, and soldiers fighting for someone else's imperial ambitions far from home. Technology was not the decisive factor. Human factors were. Adwa should have taught European powers that colonialism was not inevitable or easy, argues Professor Del Boca. That African societies were capable of sophisticated resistance. That victory required more than racial superiority myths. But most European powers learned nothing. They continued aggressive colonization for another 60 years until the entire colonial system collapsed after World War II. The battlefield of Adwa is quiet now. The town itself is small, unremarkable except for the monuments to the battle. Tourists occasionally visit, mostly Ethiopians making pilgrimage to the site of their nation's greatest military victory. The bones of Italian and Ethiopian soldiers who fell on March 1, 1896, have long since returned to the earth. The weapons have rusted away. The cries of the wounded have faded into silence. But the meaning of Adwa endures, and it speaks across 128 years with uncomfortable clarity about empire, resistance, race, and the limits of power. Europe in the 1890s believed it was destined to rule the world. European powers had conquered vast territories with relative ease. The combination of modern weapons, industrial capacity, and, they believed, racial superiority seemed to guarantee victory over any non-European opponent. Adwa demolished that myth. An African nation using the same modern weapons Europeans wielded, led by competent African commanders, destroyed a European army. Not through guerrilla tactics or attrition, but in open battle, army against army. The lesson was clear. European military dominance was contextual, not absolute. Technology could be acquired. Tactics could be learned. And an army fighting for its homeland's survival would always have advantages no colonial force could match. Adwa proved that colonialism was a choice, not an inevitability, reflects Professor Marcus. It required African disunity, superior European technology, and African leaders who couldn't or wouldn't resist. Ethiopia had unity, acquired technology, and leaders absolutely committed to resistance. That combination was enough to stop an empire. The tragedy is that so few learned this lesson. European colonization of Africa continued for another 60 years, requiring massive violence and eventually African liberation movements to undo. But Adwa planted a seed. The idea that European empires could be defeated, that independence was possible, that resistance was not futile. Ethiopia won at Adwa because it achieved something rare in African history: unified national resistance. Menelik united Christian and Muslim, North and South, noble and peasant, under a single cause, defending Ethiopian independence. Regional rivals put aside their disputes. Religious differences were subordinated to national survival. This unity was Menelik and Taitu's greatest achievement, more important than acquiring modern weapons, more crucial than tactical decisions on the battlefield. Ethiopia shows us what's possible when a nation unites against external threat, suggests Dr. Berhane Selassie. But it also shows how rare that unity is, how difficult to achieve, how dependent on exceptional leadership. Menelik and Taitu created that unity through years of patient diplomacy, personal relationships with regional leaders, and clear vision of the stakes. It wasn't automatic or inevitable. It was the product of hard political work. The lesson resonates beyond Ethiopia. Divided peoples are vulnerable. United peoples can resist the strongest powers, but unity requires leadership, trust, shared identity, and willingness to sacrifice parochial interests for collective survival. Those are always in short supply. We celebrate Ethiopia's victory, as we should. But we must also acknowledge the cost. 12 to 15,000 Ethiopians died or were severely wounded at Adwa and in the campaign leading up to it. Thousands more died from disease and privation during the mobilization. The economic cost of maintaining a 100,000-man army for months was staggering. Regions were depopulated of working-age men. Farms went untended. The treasury was depleted, purchasing weapons and supplies. Ethiopia won its independence but paid dearly for it. We romanticize resistance, and we should honor courage, notes Professor Jonas. But we must also remember that fighting empires is costly even when you win. The Ethiopian people bore enormous sacrifices to remain free. We diminish those sacrifices if we treat Adwa as an easy victory or an inevitable outcome. Freedom is expensive. It requires sacrifice that those living in long independent nations often forget. Adwa reminds us what freedom costs and that sometimes the cost is worth paying. Modern Ethiopia's relationship with Adwa is complicated. For many Ethiopians, Adwa is a source of immense national pride, the day Ethiopia proved itself Africa's defender, the beacon of black independence in a colonized continent. But others note that Menelik's Ethiopia was itself an empire, a Christian Amhara-dominated state that conquered and colonized southern and western territories in the same period it was resisting Italian colonization from the north. Ethiopia's victory over Italy doesn't erase its own imperial expansion, argues Professor Gebru Tareka, historian at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Menelik was simultaneously resisting colonization and colonizing others. This complexity is important. We can celebrate Ethiopian resistance to European imperialism while acknowledging Ethiopian imperialism toward its own peripheries. History is rarely as simple as we want it to be. Heroes are flawed. Victims can also be perpetrators. Liberation in one context can coexist with oppression in another. Grappling with this complexity doesn't diminish Adwa's significance. It makes it more human, more real, more relevant to our own complicated present. On March 2nd each year, Ethiopia celebrates Adwa Victory Day, a national holiday commemorating the battle. Ethiopians gather at monuments, listen to speeches, watch military parades, and remember the day their ancestors defeated an empire. For Ethiopians in a country that has faced military coups, civil wars, famines, and continued external pressures, Adwa remains a touchstone, proof that Ethiopia has survived worse and will survive again. For people of African descent worldwide, Adwa remains a symbol of black achievement and resistance against white supremacy. For historians of colonialism, Adwa is the exception that proves the rule. The one place European colonization was decisively defeated in the scramble for Africa. demonstrating both the power and the limits of African resistance. Picture Lieutenant Giuseppe Galliano in his final years, an old man in Genoa, sitting in a cafe, watching the ships in the harbor. He survived Adwa, one of the lucky ones. He returned to Italy, finished his military service, and lived a quiet life. He never spoke publicly about the battle, never wrote memoirs, never sought to explain or justify, but sometimes, in his sleep, he hears the Ethiopian war drums again, sees the ridges covered with warriors, feels the panic as the formation collapsed and the retreat became a rout. He does not hate Ethiopians. How can he hate people defending their homeland? He hates the politicians who sent him there, the generals who marched the army into disaster, the empire builders who sacrificed lives for pride and ambition. When Italy invades Ethiopia again in 1935, 75-year-old Giuseppe writes a letter to Mussolini, never sent, found among his papers after his death, begging him not to repeat the disaster, warning that Ethiopia will fight and Italy will regret the adventure. The letter is ignored. Giuseppe dies in 1937, before Italy's Second Ethiopian War ends in Pyrrhic victory and eventual expulsion. He is buried in an unmarked grave. No memorial honors him. He is a footnote to a disaster Italy would prefer to forget. Picture Balcha Safo, the peasant boy turned general, in 1935, 75 years old, watching Italian bombers destroy Ethiopian cities. He has spent 40 years serving Ethiopia. He fought at Adwa as a boy. He commanded armies as a man. He helped build the modern Ethiopian state. Now he watches it all threatened again by the same enemy. When the government considers surrender, Balcha refuses. He takes his warriors to the mountains and fights a guerrilla campaign against the occupiers. For 6 years, he harries Italian garrisons, ambushes convoys, keeps resistance alive. He dies in 1936, killed in an Italian ambush. His last words reportedly, "I fought them at Adwa. I will fight them in death." His body is never recovered, but his memory endures. The boy from Adwa, who never surrendered, who embodied the spirit that defeated Italy in 1896 and would eventually defeat them again. Picture Empress Taitu in her final years, sidelined from power after Menelik's stroke in 1909, watching younger leaders maneuver for succession. She has helped save Ethiopia. She organized the supplies that fed the army at Adwa. She commanded warriors in battle. She was partner to an emperor and power in her own right. Now she is forgotten by the men who inherited the nation she helped defend. She dies in 1918 as World War I devastates the European empires that once threatened Ethiopia. She lives just long enough to see those empires weakened, to know that Ethiopia's survival will outlast many of its enemies. Her last recorded words are, "I preserved Ethiopia. That is enough." It is more than enough. The sun sets over the Ethiopian highlands, the same sun that rose over Adwa on March 1st, 1896. The land remains, the people endure, the nation survives. That is what Adwa means. That is what it teaches, that empires fall but peoples remain, that the powerful can be defeated by the determined, that technology is no substitute for justice, that fighting for your homeland's freedom is the most ancient and honorable cause, that one battle, on one day, can change not just political boundaries but the entire psychology of resistance, can prove that the impossible is merely the difficult, can plant seeds of liberation that grow for generations. On March 1st, 1896, 100,000 Ethiopians stood against an empire and won. And in winning, they showed the world that Africa would not go quietly into colonization's night. That resistance was possible. That freedom was worth fighting for. The highlands remember. And so should we. The Battle of Adwa was fought on March 1st, 1896, near Adwa, in northern Ethiopia. Ethiopian forces, approximately 100,000 warriors under Emperor Menelik II. Casualties, 4,000 to 5,000 killed, 8,000 to 10,000 wounded. Italian forces, approximately 17,700, 10,600 Italian soldiers, 7,100 Eritrean askaris under General Oreste Baratieri. Casualties: 7,000 killed, 1,500 wounded, 3,000 captured. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, October 26, 1896, established Ethiopian independence and annulled Italy's colonial claims. Ethiopia remained independent until Italian occupation 1936 to 1941, then regained independence. Adwa Victory Day is celebrated annually on March 2nd in Ethiopia. We remember the courage of all who fought for independence, for survival, for their homeland. Adwa was not just Ethiopia's victory, it was a victory for the entire colonized world. It proved that European empires were not invincible, that African nations could resist, that liberation was possible. Every anti-colonial movement of the 20th century drew inspiration from Adwa. Every struggle for independence invoked Ethiopia's example. In that sense, the battle fought on March 1st, 1896 is still being fought. Every time oppressed peoples stand up to power and say no more. Professor Raymond Jonas. He who does not know his history is condemned to repeat it. Ethiopian proverb. Ethiopia has always been free. Ethiopia will always be free. This is what our ancestors proved at Adwa. Emperor Haile Selassie. When black men rise, empires tremble. Marcus Garvey, speaking of Adwa.